in the small town of Maplewood, nestled among rolling hills and vast fields, lived a 24-year-old man named Ethan Thompson, known for his dependability and strong work ethic. Ethan had inherited his father's modest auto shop. Thompson's auto shop. It was a place that grounded him, filled with the familiar scent of motor oil and the rhythmic clanking of tools. Despite the long hours and dedication, the income was barely enough to cover his living expenses, leaving his dream of expanding the garage just out of reach. Each day was a struggle to stay afloat. The bills piled up, and while Ethan hoped for a brighter future, it seemed to remain beyond his grasp. But the shop was his sanctuary, and he clung to it for purpose. One chilly autumn evening, after a long day of work, Ethan locked up the garage, feeling the weight of his responsibilities. As he stepped outside, the rain began to pour, soaking him instantly. The streets of Maplewood were slick, the lights from the town barely cutting through the storm. As he trudged home, a screeching of tires pierced the night. Ethan's heart raced as he looked up, seeing a luxury car losing control on the wet road. The car veered off the road and crashed into a tree at the edge of a ravine with a deafening crash. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the car teetered on the edge of the slope. Without thinking, Ethan dropped his bag and sprinted toward the wreck. The rain drenched him as he reached the car, which hung dangerously on the ravine's edge. Peering through the broken window, he saw a woman trapped inside, her eyes wide with fear. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed a tire iron, smashed the window, and offered his hand to her. "Take my hand," Ethan urged, his voice strained from the cold. The woman hesitated, but with tears and rain mixing on her face. She grabbed his hand. Ethan pulled her out just as the car shifted, and they both tumbled to the ground. Breathless, she looked up at him, shaken but grateful. You saved me," she stammered. Ethan offered a small smile, still catching his breath, just doing what anyone would do. She looked at him with gratitude, mixed with confusion. "Please, let me reward you. You deserve it." Ethan shook his head gently. "You don't owe me anything. I'm just glad you're okay." He stood up and, without another word, walked away, disappearing into the storm. The woman, still shaken, watched him go, unaware that this brief encounter would change both of their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The next morning, Charlotte Morgan, the CEO of Morgan Technologies, sat in her sleek office, surrounded by the hum of the business world, used to being admired and feared. Charlotte was intrigued by the mechanic who had saved her life the night before. Unlike most people in her circle, Ethan had acted without a hint of self-interest, and that intrigued her. "I want to know who pulled me from the wreck last night," she ordered her assistant, Sarah. "Find out everything about him." Within hours, Sarah had gathered the information. "His name is Ethan Thompson. He works at Thompson's auto shop on Main Street." Charlotte sat back, her curiosity piqued. She had always been good at recognizing potential, and something about Ethan's selflessness made her want to know more. She decided she needed to meet him. Later that afternoon, Charlotte's black SUV rolled up in front of Thompson's auto shop. The sound of tools clanking and engines revving filled the air as she walked toward the garage, her heels clicking against the cracked pavement. Workers in grease-stained coveralls barely looked up, too busy with their work. But as Charlotte approached, her presence immediately drew attention. Ethan, underneath the hood of an old Ford, straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag. When he saw her, he felt an uncomfortable flush rise in his neck. Her tailored coat and confident posture felt like a world apart from his. "Ethan," Charlotte called, her voice warm yet confident. Ethan wiped his hands again. "You didn't have to come here." "Ma'am," he stammered, unsure of what was happening. Charlotte handed him her business card. "If you ever need anything, call me. I mean it." Ethan hesitated, staring at the card for a moment. Her world felt far removed from his, and he wasn't sure he belonged in hers. But he smiled politely, pocketing the card as she turned to leave. Mike, his boss, nudged him with a knowing look. "Kid, that's an opportunity knocking. Don't be too proud to answer." Ethan chuckled nervously, but doubt lingered in his mind. People like him didn't belong in worlds like hers, or so he thought. 2 days later, an envelope was delivered to the shop, embossed with the logo of Morgan Technologies. The paper felt heavy in his hands, and Ethan hesitated before opening it. The idea of stepping into a world so different from his own made his stomach churn, but curiosity pushed him forward. When he arrived at the Glass and Steel building, he felt small in the sea of suits and briefcases. The lobby was sleek and bustling, filled with people who seemed to know exactly where they were going. He was led to the top floor, where Charlotte's office offered a breathtaking view of the city. "Thank you for coming." Charlotte greeted him warmly as she stood to greet him. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling out of place. "I'm not sure why I'm here." Charlotte's eyes met his, her gaze steady. "You saved my life, Ethan, and I don't think it was just luck. You didn't ask for anything in return. That tells me something about your character." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what anyone would do." Charlotte leaned forward, her expression firm yet kind. "I see potential in you. I want to offer you a job here, start as my assistant, and let's see where it takes you." Ethan blinked in shock. "A job? But I'm just a mechanic." Charlotte smiled. "You're more than that. Let me prove it to you." After a long pause, Ethan took a deep breath. "Okay, I'll do it." And just like that, his life began to change. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Ethan Thompson. He had stepped into a world that was unfamiliar, overwhelming, and vastly different from the quiet, hands-on life he had known in Maplewood. The sleek, glass walls of Morgan Technologies felt almost like a barrier between him and the world he was used to. The sound of polished shoes tapping against the marble floors, the constant hum of phone calls and meetings, it all seemed so alien to him. The offices were immaculate, their perfection a stark contrast to the grease-stained coveralls and oil-streaked hands he was used to. Ethan had always prided himself on his hard work and integrity. But now, in the midst of this high-powered corporate world, he felt like an outsider. His borrowed suit felt uncomfortable, itchy against his skin, and he spent most of his days shadowing Charlotte Morgan, trying to absorb every bit of knowledge he could. He learned the ropes of the business, following Charlotte through meetings, taking notes, and slowly starting to understand the language of the corporate world. Despite the discomfort, Ethan was determined to prove himself. Charlotte had seen something in him, and he wasn't about to waste this opportunity. He spent his evenings poring over business books, watching tutorial videos online, and trying to bridge the knowledge gap between his mechanical background and the complex world of high-tech business. Charlotte noticed his effort. She left encouraging notes on his desk, reminding him to keep pushing. "You're doing great, Ethan," one of the notes read. Her words helped him through the toughest days, giving him a sense of purpose. But not everyone shared Charlotte's belief in him. The whispers in the office began almost immediately. Some of the senior executives, threatened by his sudden rise, were quick to show their disdain. Mark Thompson, a senior manager known for his ambition and cutthroat attitude, was especially vocal. He made no effort to hide his distaste for Ethan's presence. "He's just a charity case," Mark muttered one afternoon, loud enough for Ethan to hear. The words stung, and for a moment, Ethan's confidence wavered, but he quickly shook it off. He wasn't here to please anyone. He was here to prove himself. Despite the whispers, Ethan continued to focus on his work. He refused to let negativity derail him. Every day was a test of endurance, and though the challenges were difficult, he knew he had to keep pushing forward. The turning point came during a team meeting when Ethan was asked to present a new project idea he had been working on. Mark Thompson, sitting at the head of the table, sneered as Ethan stood to speak. "This is amateur hour," Mark said sarcastically, his voice dripping with disdain. "Why are we even entertaining this? This is pointless." Ethan's heart sank. His hands trembled as he gathered his notes, ready to retreat. But then he looked across the table and caught Charlotte's eye. She didn't say anything, but her steady gaze, her calm expression, gave him the strength to keep going. Taking a deep breath, Ethan began to speak with newfound confidence. He related his experience in the auto shop to his ideas for improving the company's operations. "In a garage, You solve problems quickly and efficiently, he said, his voice growing stronger. I see the same inefficiencies here that can be fixed with some simple, practical adjustments. The room went silent. Slowly, heads began to nod, and even Mark, though still skeptical, seemed to begrudgingly respect Ethan's perspective. Charlotte smiled, her pride in Ethan evident. Well done, Ethan, she said with a note of approval. For the first time since joining Morgan Technologies, Ethan felt like he truly belonged. His unique background had given him a perspective that others lacked. And for the first time, he realized he could contribute something meaningful. The world he had once thought he didn't belong in was beginning to open up to him. But the challenges were far from over. As Ethan Thompson settled into his new role at Morgan Technologies, the whispers about his rise continued to spread. Though he had proven himself in that first team meeting, some of the senior executives weren't ready to accept him. Mark Thompson, in particular, continued to make his disdain for Ethan known. He made subtle, cutting remarks, questioning Ethan's abilities at every turn. The constant murmurs of favoritism and the feeling that he didn't belong began to wear on Ethan. But he refused to let it affect him. It were too hard to get here, and he wasn't going to let anyone push him back. One day, after weeks of grueling work, the stakes for Ethan became even higher. He found himself facing a new challenge, an accusation that would threaten everything he had worked for. It started with a rumor. Mark Thompson, eager to knock Ethan down a peg, had set his sights on sabotaging him. Ethan had no idea what was coming. One afternoon, Ethan was called into a meeting with Charlotte and several other board members. A cold, formal atmosphere hung in the air. The accusations came quickly. Ethan was being investigated for financial misconduct. The weight of the words hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. His head spun. He tried to explain that he had no idea what they were talking about. But the more he protested, the more they seemed convinced. Fake documents had been planted, and an anonymous tip had led to an internal investigation. The news spread like wildfire throughout the company. And before long, all eyes were on Ethan. I didn't do this, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. I swear I didn't. The room fell into a heavy silence. And for a moment, no one spoke. Then, Charlotte stood, her expression resolute. I don't believe this, she said, her voice clear and strong. I've been working closely with Ethan. I trust him completely. We will find out who did this. Her words, though filled with conviction, did little to calm Ethan's growing anxiety. The pressure was overwhelming, and the fear of losing everything, his job, his reputation, and his newfound place in the corporate world, was almost unbearable. But Charlotte's unwavering support was the one thing that kept him from giving up. For days, Charlotte and Sarah, her assistant, worked tirelessly, digging into the details of the case. They uncovered the truth. It was Mark Thompson who had orchestrated the entire scheme, planting the false documents and manipulating the system to frame Ethan. The evidence was undeniable. When the truth came to light, Mark was immediately dismissed, and Ethan's name was cleared. The relief was overwhelming, but the experience left scars. The whispers that had once been mere annoyances now felt like a burden he had to carry, and the pressure to prove himself seemed endless. After the ordeal, Ethan found himself sitting alone in Charlotte's office, exhausted and drained. The weight of everything he had been through pressed heavily on him. I can't keep doing this, Ethan admitted, his voice heavy. I'm tired of proving myself over and over again. Charlotte, who had been there through it all, placed a hand on his shoulder. Her expression softened, the steeliness in her demeanor giving way to something more personal. Then don't prove it to them. Prove it to yourself. Her words hit Ethan hard. He realized that she was right. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving to himself that he was worthy of the success he had earned. That moment of realization was a turning point. Ethan knew he had worked hard, not for the approval of others, but because he believed in his own abilities. In the following weeks, the tension in the office gradually faded. The accusations against Ethan were forgotten as the company moved on, but the lessons he had learned stayed with him. He understood now that success wasn't just about wealth or status. It was about resilience, integrity, and believing in oneself, no matter how many obstacles stood in the way. As his confidence grew, so did his role in the company. Charlotte continued to mentor him, offering guidance and wisdom along the way. But it was Ethan who had proven to himself that he had the potential to succeed, not because of who he knew or where he came from, but because of who he was. One evening, as the sun set over the city skyline, Ethan found himself alone in Charlotte's office again. This time, however, the feeling was different. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He had earned his place in this world, and he understood that he could face whatever came next. Charlotte looked at him, a quiet pride in her eyes. "You've done it, Ethan," she said softly. "You've earned everything that's come your way." Ethan smiled, the weight of everything finally lifting from his shoulders. "I've still got a long way to go, but I know now that I'm ready." Charlotte nodded, her gaze steady. "And I'll be here to support you every step of the way." As Ethan walked out of the office that night, the weight of the past seemed to fall away. He wasn't the same man who had walked into Morgan Technologies months ago, unsure of his place. He had learned that the only way to succeed was to stay true to who he was and never give up, no matter the odds. With Charlotte's support and his own belief in himself, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. He had come a long way, but the journey was far from over. The future was uncertain. But one thing was clear: Ethan Thompson was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.